The starship's engines hummed with quiet power as it cut through the cold vacuum of space, carrying the most skilled hunters of the Androsian Empire toward an unfamiliar world. Captain Kale stood at the helm, his eyes fixed on the dark orb of Earth growing ever larger on the forward screen. His hands gripped the controls, steady, unflinching, though his mind stirred with the anticipation of the mission ahead. He had led countless operations across countless worlds, hunting down predators of every form. Yet this planet held an unease he couldn't shake. The crew behind him moved in silence, their training and discipline evident in their stillness. They were the Empire's finest, warriors honed for one purpose: to neutralize any threat to the Empire's dominion. And today, their target was a species they knew little about: humans. The brief they had been given was minimal, vague. The planet's inhabitants were primitive, they were told, yet somehow they had earned the Empire's attention. They were capable of greater destruction than their primitive technologies should allow. Kale's second-in-command, Arik, stood a few paces to his left, his dark eyes scanning the ship's readouts. Arik was young for a hunter, yet his instincts were sharp, his skills honed through years of training. He had earned his place among the elite, but his restlessness had not escaped Kale's notice. The young man, though loyal, often questioned their orders, something Kale would tolerate only for so long. "We are entering the atmosphere," Arik remarked, his voice low but steady. Kale nodded, his gaze shifting to the view beyond the ship's viewport. The planet's blue and green surface seemed almost peaceful, untouched by the chaos that had long since ravaged the worlds they had already conquered. But appearances were deceiving. Kale had learned long ago never to trust what seemed tranquil. The most dangerous creatures often hid beneath the most serene facades. The ship entered the atmosphere with a faint shudder, and the crew began the process of landing. Despite the vast technological advancements at their disposal, the ship's descent was still fraught with tension. No one had seen Earth's wilderness firsthand, and there was no certainty about the dangers they would face. Would the creatures here be truly primitive, as their brief suggested? Or would they be something more, something the Empire had failed to anticipate? Kale's thoughts were interrupted as the ship finally settled onto the planet's surface. The forest surrounding them was dense and dark, the trees towering like ancient sentinels. Kale stepped down the ramp first, his boots landing heavily on the damp soil. The air smelled fresh, tinged with the scent of earth and foliage. The surrounding silence struck him immediately, unnerving in its stillness. Not even the faintest rustle of wind stirred the trees. "Stay alert," Kale ordered, his voice cold and commanding. "We don't know what we're dealing with yet." The hunters began to spread out, their boots crunching softly over the forest floor as they surveyed their surroundings. Kale scanned the area with practiced eyes, his focus sharp. The only movement was the occasional flutter of leaves, as if the wind was reluctant to make its presence known. He could feel something lurking, something watching them, but the forest gave no indication of what it might be. "I don't like this," Arik muttered from behind him, his voice barely above a whisper. "Too quiet." Kale didn't respond, but he felt the same unease gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. He knew Arik well enough to recognize the doubt in his voice. The young hunter was more attuned to his instincts than most, but his unease would have to wait. This was a mission, and Kale had never allowed emotion to cloud his judgment. The team set to work, deploying small drones and activating scanning devices designed to detect heat signatures and movement. But as the minutes stretched on, frustration mounted. The equipment was useless here. The scanners returned nothing of note. Even their thermal sensors failed to identify any living creatures, and the forest remained still, as though it were devoid of life. "Something's not right," Arik repeated, his tone now tinged with a hint of concern. "We're not picking up anything. No animals, no heat sources, nothing." Kale frowned. He had encountered strange worlds before, worlds where life had evolved in ways that defied logic, but Earth was different. The planet felt empty, though he knew it wasn't. Somewhere, deep within the trees, something watched them and it wasn't afraid. The question was, Who, or what, was doing the watching? The moment stretched on, and Kale's patience began to fray. "Keep your focus," he said, his voice hard. "It's possible we're just dealing with a lesser species. Proceed with caution." But even as he spoke, a creeping sensation crawled up his spine. It wasn't fear, not yet, but it was something far more dangerous: uncertainty. Kale had never been uncertain before. His confidence had always been unshakable. And yet, on this planet, that confidence wavered. A low growl shattered the silence, coming from deep within the trees. It was a sound so alien, so unlike anything Kale had encountered, that for a brief moment, even he hesitated. The growl was followed by a rustling sound, something moving swiftly through the underbrush just beyond their sight. Kale's hand went instinctively to the weapon at his side, the energy blade humming to life in his grip. "Prepare yourselves," he commanded. But before anyone could respond, the underbrush exploded with movement, a blur of speed, a flash of teeth. Something massive and wild leaped from the shadows, striking with ferocity that sent one of the hunters crashing to the ground. His screams were cut short as he vanished beneath the weight of the attack, and the others scattered, weapons drawn, eyes wide in panic. Kale's pulse quickened, his training kicking in as he assessed the situation. There was no time for hesitation. But even as he prepared to engage, he realized something that chilled him to the core. They hadn't seen their attacker. They hadn't even caught a glimpse of it. They were being hunted. As the remaining hunters rallied together, Kale's mind raced. Who or what was hunting them? And why couldn't they see it? The mission had just shifted, but Kale would not fail. He could not afford to, not with so much at stake. "Stay together," he ordered. "We fight as one." But even as he gave the command, he knew one thing for certain. They were no longer the predators. They were prey. The forest had gone eerily silent once again, but the hunters weren't fooled. The events of the last few minutes had unsettled them, but they had no choice but to press forward. The attack had come out of nowhere, swift and brutal, and the creature, whatever it was, had disappeared as quickly as it had struck. One of their own was gone, taken without a trace, and the rest of the group was left to deal with the aftermath of the ambush. Kale stood at the center of the group, his sharp eyes scanning the tree-line, looking for any sign of movement. His body was taut, ready for the next strike. Arik, standing at his side, wiped the blood from his blade, his face drawn in a mixture of anger and disbelief. The young hunter was no stranger to combat, but there had been something unnatural about the attack, something that rattled even him. How did it move so fast? Arik murmured, his voice laced with frustration. "We never even saw it coming." Kale didn't answer immediately, his mind focused on the task at hand. The enemy was elusive, a predator that had learned to hunt them in their own element. The hunter had become the hunted, and the shift in power left a bitter taste in his mouth. He couldn't afford to let doubt cloud his judgment, not now. If they were to survive, they had to adapt. "We need to regroup," Kale said, his voice cold, steady. "Spread out and find a defensible position. This place is crawling with threats, and we can't risk losing any more of us." The hunters nodded, though their faces betrayed a mixture of fear and reluctance. They had been trained to fight, to conquer, but this was different. They weren't fighting an enemy they could see, an enemy they could plan for. This was something else entirely. Kale motioned for Arik to follow him as they moved deeper into the forest. The trees grew thicker the further they went, the canopy overhead blocking out much of the daylight. The air was thick with moisture, the scent of damp earth and rotting vegetation strong in their nostrils. The tension between the hunters was palpable, and Kale could feel their nerves on edge, every step watched, every rustle of leaves a potential danger. "I've been thinking," Arik began, his voice quiet but heavy with meaning. "Maybe it's not just one creature. Maybe we're dealing with something more. A whole colony or a pack, even. Something that works together." Kale didn't reply right away. The thought had crossed his mind as well, but he didn't want to admit it. If the predators were organized, If they were coordinated in some way, their mission had just grown far more complicated. He had thought Earth to be a primitive world, one that would offer no real challenge beyond the occasional wild beast. But now he wasn't so sure. I don't care what we're dealing with, Kale said finally, his voice hard. We have a job to do, and we'll do it. Keep your wits about you. Arik shot him a glance but said nothing, knowing full well that Kale's mind was already set. The captain wasn't one to be shaken easily. Yet even Kale couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease gnawing at the edges of his mind. The longer they stayed in the forest, the more he felt like prey, like something was stalking them, studying their every move. A low growl echoed through the trees, cutting through the stillness like a knife. Kale's muscles tensed, and the group came to an abrupt halt. It wasn't the same growl as before, but the sound was close, too close. This time, the growl was deeper, more menacing. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as the hunters readied their weapons. Weapons designed for battle, but not for what they were about to face. The growl turned into a screech, a horrific sound that sent a shiver down Kale's spine. Then, from the darkness, something moved. Fast, silent, too fast. A blur of fur and teeth emerged from the shadows, launching itself at one of the hunters, a massive beast the size of a bull. Its claws slashed through the air with terrifying precision, and its jaws snapped shut around the unlucky hunter's neck before anyone could react. Blood splattered across the forest floor as the beast dragged its prey into the darkness. The hunter never had a chance to scream. Fire! Kale barked, his voice sharp with authority. He drew his blade and rushed forward, knowing there was no time to waste. The group opened fire, their energy weapons lighting up the darkness as they unleashed a barrage of energy blasts into the forest. But the creature was too quick. It darted between the trees, moving with a speed that defied logic. No matter how fast they shot, no matter how many shots found their mark, the creature evaded them, slipping through their lines as though it knew exactly where to go. Another growl, louder this time. The creature was not alone. Retreat! Kale shouted, realizing the full extent of their mistake. They had been too confident, too sure of their superiority. This was no simple predator. The earth-silent killers were not to be underestimated. As the hunters fell back, Kale's mind raced. They had been blindsided, outmaneuvered. For the first time in his career, Kale felt the edge of fear scrape against his consciousness. He had thought the Empire's technology and tactics were invincible. But here, on this primitive world, they were nothing more than prey, just like the animals they had been sent to eliminate. The hunt was no longer about victory. It was about survival. The group regrouped in a small clearing, breathing heavily as they assessed the situation. Their numbers were dwindling. The creatures were relentless, their ambushes precise. "We need to leave," Arik said, his voice barely a whisper. His earlier confidence had faltered, replaced by the raw fear that Kale had seen in the eyes of lesser men. Kale met his gaze and nodded. It was a rare moment of vulnerability from a leader who prided himself on control, but there was no denying the truth. They were losing. They had underestimated their enemy, and now it was time to reassess their strategy. For the first time in his life, Kale considered retreat. The silent killers were hunting them, and there was no escape unless they could turn the tide. The night pressed in around them, thick and suffocating. The hunters had retreated deep into the heart of the forest, where the shadows seemed to gather and thicken. Kale stood at the edge of a small clearing, scanning the darkness with his sharp eyes, every nerve on high alert. His team was down to 6, and morale was lower than he'd ever seen it. Their weapons were functional, their technology advanced, but none of it seemed to matter in the face of the invisible enemy that had torn through them with ruthless efficiency. "We can't keep running," Arik said, his voice a mix of frustration and resolve. "We need to turn the tables. Fight back." Kale didn't respond immediately. Arik had been restless ever since the first attack, a young hunter eager to prove himself, eager to turn the tide in their favor. But Kale knew better than to let his emotions drive their decisions. This was no longer about the mission. It was about survival. If they didn't regain control of the situation, there would be no mission left to complete. Quiet, Kale muttered, cutting Arik off before he could speak again. We don't know where they are. Keep your senses sharp. The sound of Arik's breath catching in his throat told Kale everything he needed to know. Arik had heard something. A rustle in the leaves, the faintest shift in the air. It was subtle, nearly imperceptible. But to someone as attuned to danger as Kale, it was as clear as daylight. Something was out there, watching them, waiting. Kale held up a hand, signaling for the group to halt. They had been moving through the forest in a tight formation, using every tool at their disposal to track the silent killers. They had deployed drones, set up motion sensors, and even tried thermal scans, but nothing had yielded results. The forest seemed to swallow their technology whole. No creature, no matter how deadly, should have been able to evade their sensors so easily. It was as though the killers knew how to hide themselves, how to become a part of the forest itself. We need a plan, Kale said finally, his voice low but steady. Arik, take 2 of the others and set up a perimeter. I want this area locked down. The rest of us will search for signs, track their movements. Arik nodded, already moving off with his 2 selected hunters, Yarrick and Rika, their weapons drawn and their steps light. Kale watched them go, then turned to his remaining hunters, each of them battle-hardened but beginning to show signs of wear. They were tired, on edge, but Kale couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. We've underestimated them, Kale muttered under his breath. It wasn't a statement he often made. He was a leader, someone who didn't acknowledge failure easily. But this was different. The enemy wasn't some wild animal to be tracked down and slain. The silent killers were something else entirely. Noted, said Rigger, a stoic hunter with a knack for reading the environment. His voice was as flat as ever, but his eyes flickered with an unspoken realization. They were in unknown territory, fighting an enemy whose methods they didn't understand. They moved slowly, methodically. Every rustle, every snap of a twig beneath their boots had the hunters jumping to attention, weapons at the ready. They had no choice but to take the forest's eerie silence as a warning. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed, then hours. The hunt for their unseen assailant was slow and grueling, every step weighed down by the oppressive silence that pressed in from all sides. They made no progress, not in the way Kale had hoped. The tracking devices still showed nothing. The drones returned nothing but static. They were flying blind. Then, just as the tension reached a breaking point, a sudden shift in the air made the hairs on the back of Kale's neck stand on end. His instincts kicked into overdrive, and before he could even think, he dropped to one knee, his energy blade already drawn. He could feel it now. The presence. It was close, closer than ever. Ready, he hissed, his voice barely a whisper. The forest was still. Too still. Then a flicker, a blur in the distance, darting between the trees with the speed of a striking serpent. Kale's heart hammered in his chest. It was here. It was real. They weren't imagining it. Fire, he barked. The hunters unleashed a torrent of energy blasts, their weapons lighting up the forest like a small star. But the target, whatever it was faster. Too fast. The creature darted again, slipping through the trees with unnerving precision, avoiding every shot as if it could anticipate their movements. It was playing with them. Kale cursed under his breath, but he didn't give up. He wasn't a leader who backed down from a fight, not when it counted. Stay together. We don't let it isolate us. We move as one. The team regrouped, closing ranks and positioning themselves in a defensive formation. Kale's mind raced. He had to think, had to adapt. The silent killer was a master of stealth, but it had one weakness. It needed the element of surprise to strike. Arik! Kale shouted. Flank left. Draw its attention. Arik nodded, taking his 2 hunters with him, moving swiftly through the forest with the stealth of ghosts. The creature had already shown its preference for quick, surgical strikes. If they could bait it into revealing itself, they might finally get a shot at it. Minutes passed in a tense silence. Then, the forest seemed to hold its breath once again. Kale's pulse quickened. They had the advantage of surprise now. He knew it. The hunt had just shifted in their favor. The moment came like a storm, a rustling, followed by a low growl. The silent killer emerged, a massive shadow moving with deadly speed, its fangs bared. Arik's team was ready. They fired in tandem, their weapons lighting up the darkness, but this time they were prepared. They'd anticipated the creature's movements. One of the blasts hit its mark, striking the beast in its side, but it didn't stop. It roared furious and darted forward again with the same terrifying speed, determined to close the gap between them. This time, though, it wasn't prepared for the trap. As it lunged, Kale moved, his blade flashing in the night air. The creature tried to evade, but it was too late. The blade met its flesh, cutting through the beast's side in a deadly arc. It screeched in pain, its claws slashing in desperation, but Kale was faster. With a final, precise strike, the creature fell. It was over. For now. The hunters stood over the silent killer's corpse, breathing heavily. Kale wiped the sweat from his brow, his heart still racing. They had won this round, but they had learned a painful truth. They were far from the predators they thought they were. The hunt for the silent killers had only just begun. The silence that followed the battle was almost suffocating. Kale stood over the fallen creature, watching as the last spark of life faded from its eyes. It had been a dangerous opponent, one they had underestimated. But now, with it lying still at his feet, there was a strange sense of emptiness. The feeling wasn't victory, but the hollow aftermath of realizing just how vulnerable they truly were. They had killed one, but how many more were there? And what kind of species had the ability to strike so swiftly, so silently? Kale wiped his blade clean, his expression unreadable. His hunters stood around him, equally silent, each of them processing the confrontation in their own way. Arik, still brimming with the adrenaline of the moment, was the first to speak. "It's a start," he said, looking down at the beast's body. "But there's something more here, something intelligent. It wasn't just the creature we fought. It's the way it moved, how it knew exactly when to strike. It's no animal." Kale glanced at Arik, considering his words. The young hunter wasn't wrong. He had witnessed it too. The calculated speed, the preternatural ability to anticipate their movements. The silent killer wasn't just a predator. It was part of a larger, more sophisticated force. Kale felt it in his bones. They weren't just fighting beasts. They were facing a resistance. "We need to think smarter," Kale said, his voice steady despite the gnawing doubt in the back of his mind. "They're not just hiding in the shadows. They're working together, waiting for us to make a mistake. Then let's turn the tables," Arik insisted. "We can't just keep reacting to them. We need a plan." Kale met his gaze, the challenge in Arik's words sinking in. The young hunter was right. For too long, they had been at the mercy of whatever these creatures were. But no longer. The time had come to take control. The Empire had sent them here as the finest hunters in the galaxy, and it was time to prove it. "All right," Kale said, nodding. "We'll make them chase us. We'll set a trap." He turned to the rest of the group, his voice rising with the authority that had made him a leader. "Listen up. We can't keep moving aimlessly through this forest. We're being watched, and every moment we waste is another chance for them to pick us off. But we have the advantage now. We've seen how they fight. We've seen their weakness." The hunters gathered around, their faces grim but focused. They had all seen the beast's speed, the way it had outmaneuvered them with terrifying precision. But now they were learning. Now they understood. They weren't just fighting to survive. They were fighting to outwit their enemies. "We're going to lure them in," Kale continued. "We'll use their instincts against them. We'll force them to show themselves." Arik's eyes narrowed, a sly grin creeping across his face. "You mean We're going to hunt the hunters. Exactly, Kale replied, his voice cold and calculating. We'll set up a series of false trails, decoy positions, and when they take the bait, we'll hit them from all sides. The plan was simple, but it relied on one thing above all else: timing. They had to draw the silent killers out, make them believe they had the upper hand. The hunters would split up, create false movements through the forest, lead the creatures into a false sense of superiority. Then, when the moment came, they would strike, turning the tables in an instant. Kale motioned for Arik and the others to begin their work, and without hesitation, they set to work. They worked quickly, using their knowledge of the terrain and their training to lay the perfect trap. The forest, vast and unfamiliar, became their weapon. Every tree, every shadow, every faint rustle of leaves was calculated, each step deliberately designed to create an illusion. They weren't just moving through the forest anymore. They were weaving a web, pulling their enemies in, drawing them closer. As the hours passed, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was the same feeling he had felt earlier, the sensation of something just beyond his sight, lurking in the edges of his awareness. He had seen it in the way the silent killers moved, heard it in the unnatural stillness of the forest. There was something else here, something more than the creatures themselves. Kale, Arik's voice cut through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. It's done. We're ready. Kale nodded and turned to face the hunters. Position yourselves. This is it. We make our stand here. The hunters moved into place, each of them taking their assigned positions with practiced ease. They had become more than a team. They had become a unit, a singular force working toward a common goal. Kale could feel the energy in the air, the tension building as the trap was set. Minutes passed. Then the first sign appeared, a faint rustle in the trees, barely perceptible, but it was enough. The silent killers were coming. They had taken the bait. Kale's heart pounded in his chest. The moment had arrived. He nodded to Arik, signaling him to move into position. The young hunter crouched low, his body tense, ready to spring into action. Suddenly, the silence was broken. A creature emerged from the shadows, its movements fluid, precise. But this time it wasn't just one. There were more, 3, 4, maybe more. They moved in unison, their eyes glinting in the darkness, their predatory instincts honed to perfection. But they were too late. The hunters were already in position, waiting for the moment when they would strike. Kale's fingers twitched, his pulse steady but sharp as he waited for the right signal. The creatures stepped forward, their eyes locked on the decoy positions, oblivious of the real threat lying in wait. And then, just as they crossed the line, Kale gave the signal. Now! The hunters unleashed a barrage of fire. The decoys were discarded in an instant. The silent killers caught off guard, momentarily disoriented. They reacted with lightning speed, but it was too late. Kale and the others moved in, closing the gap, their weapons humming with lethal precision. The silent killers fought back, but they were no longer the predators. The hunters had anticipated every move, every feint, and they struck with deadly efficiency. The tables had turned. The silent killers were no longer invisible. They were exposed, vulnerable. One by one, the creatures fell, their bodies collapsing into the underbrush. Kale stood over the last of them, his weapon raised, watching as it struggled in its final moments. He felt no satisfaction, no joy. There was no triumph in this kill. They had won, yes, but at what cost? The silent killers were not just predators. They were part of something larger, something more insidious. And though the battle was over, the war was far from won. The forest had fallen silent again, but this time the stillness felt different. The hunters stood over the fallen bodies of the silent killers, their breaths coming in short, jagged gasps. They had won the battle, but it felt more like a temporary reprieve than a victory. The creatures had been vicious, relentless, and cunning, but Kale knew there was something deeper at play. They had faced the tip of the spear. Now, the rest of it was coming for them. Kale wiped the blood from his blade and sheathed it with a deliberate motion, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that the war wasn't over, that this was only the beginning. These creatures, as formidable as they were part of something much larger. And it wasn't just the forest that was watching them now. He felt it in the air, thick with the weight of an unseen presence. "We need to move," Kale said, his voice low but commanding. "Now?" Arik glanced at him, confusion flickering in his eyes. "But we've just finished with them. We should secure the area." "No," Kale cut him off, his gaze sharp. "This isn't over. There's something bigger coming." The hunters didn't argue. They had seen the same thing, the uneasy, predatory stillness that filled the air. Without a word, they gathered their gear, their movements sharp and practiced, their focus returning to the task at hand. They couldn't afford to linger. The creatures might have been defeated for now, but they were only part of a larger force. Kale led the team through the dense undergrowth, his senses on high alert. He knew what they were up against now. They were fighting something beyond mere survival. These killers were an extension of something far more dangerous, something that had learned how to move through the shadows and strike with precision. It wasn't just a forest anymore. They had stirred something, and whatever it was coming for them. Hours passed, and still they moved in silence. The deeper they ventured into the heart of the forest, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the ground beneath their boots grew uneven, treacherous. It was as if the planet itself had become aware of their presence, shifting in response to their movements. Then in the distance they heard it, a sound like thunder, low and ominous, shaking the very ground beneath them. Kale's heart skipped a beat. It was the sound of something large, something powerful, moving through the forest. But it wasn't just any creature. This was something else, something that could tear through them in a heartbeat. "Stay tight," Kale whispered to the group. "We don't know what's coming." The rumbling grew louder, closer. Kale could feel it vibrating in his chest now, the weight of it pressing down on him. He glanced at his hunters, their faces tense, their weapons ready. They had come this far, and they were not backing down now. They had faced death together, and now they would face whatever nightmare was charging toward them. From the darkness emerged the true predator, a massive creature, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, its body covered in dark, scaled armor that shimmered in the faint light filtering through the canopy. It was like nothing Kale had ever seen before, a nightmarish blend of organic and mechanical, its movements precise and calculated. This wasn't a wild animal. This was something engineered, something crafted for a single purpose: to kill. The creature's gaze locked onto Kale, its cold, calculating eyes narrowing. It opened its maw, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth, and let out a deafening roar that shook the trees. "Hold your ground," Kale shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "We fight together." The hunters responded instantly, forming a defensive perimeter around Kale. They had trained for moments like this, moments when everything came down to sheer will and precision. The creature charged, its massive body moving with terrifying speed. Kale didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, his energy blade flashing in the dim light, aiming for the creature's exposed underbelly. But the creature was faster, its tail whipping around and slamming into Kale's side with bone-crushing force. He was thrown to the ground, his breath knocked out of him. Pain shot through his body, but Kale didn't have time to feel it. He pushed through the pain, rolling to his feet and raising his blade once more. "Arik, now!" Kale barked. Arik didn't need any further command. He was already moving, his own weapon drawn, and he struck with the precision of a trained hunter. The creature roared in fury as Arik's shot landed, but it didn't falter. It was as if the creature had no weakness. It was too powerful, too relentless. The battle raged on, a blur of motion and flashing weapons. The hunters fought with everything they had, their movements synchronized, their attacks calculated. But the creature seemed to anticipate their every move. For every strike they landed, the creature retaliated with twice the force, its strength overwhelming their combined efforts. Kale's mind raced. They needed to find its weakness. There had to be one. Rigor. Take the left flank. Kale shouted, his voice full of urgency. Yarrick. Cover the rears. As the hunters repositioned, Kale's gaze never left the creature. It was relentless, its attacks more brutal with each passing moment. They were being worn down, their stamina draining as the creature continued its assault. But Kale refused to give up. They couldn't. Not now. In a flash of insight, Kale realized what needed to be done. The creature's movements were mechanical, predictable. It wasn't just a monster. It was a weapon engineered for destruction. If they could disrupt its core, disable its systems, they might have a chance. He turned to Arik, his voice tight. Aim for the center, the core. It has to be exposed. Arik nodded, his eyes narrowing in determination. Without hesitation, he fired. The shot hit its mark. For a moment, the creature seemed to pause, its body shuddering. Then it howled in pain, its limbs twitching violently as sparks flew from its chest. It staggered, and Kale saw his opening. With everything he had left, he rushed forward, his energy blades slicing through the air, aiming for the exposed core. The creature let out one final, guttural roar before it collapsed, its massive body crumpling to the ground in a heap of wreckage. Kale stood over it, panting, his body battered and bruised. The silence that followed was deafening. The forest was still once more. We did it, Arik said quietly, his voice shaking. Kale didn't answer immediately. The fight was over, but the war wasn't won. He knew it. The creatures, the silent killers, were part of something much bigger, something that had just begun to reveal itself. The hunters had won this battle, but the real fight was only just beginning. They were no longer just hunters. They were the resistance, and they were going to need everything they had to survive the war to come.